On March 11th, 1874, at approximately 4:45 in the afternoon, two men stood on a steamboat platform in Indianola, Texas, minutes from escaping the violence that had consumed their lives. By the time the sun set over Matagorda Bay 2 hours later, both lay dead on the wooden dock, shot down in front of their wives by men who'd ridden through the day to find them. The port city of Indianola smelled of salt water and cattle dung from the holding pens, where longhorns waited for shipment north. The SS St. Mary, a side-wheel paddle steamer bound for New Orleans, sat ready for departure, steam rising from twin stacks into the clear spring air. Temperature hovered near 70 degrees. A Gulf breeze carried the sounds of dock workers shouting, cargo being loaded, gulls circling overhead. William Sutton, 27 years old, thought distance would save him. His wife had just stepped into the ladies' salon. His friend Gabriel Slaughter stood beside him. Luggage loaded, tickets purchased, escape imminent. Then 3 horsemen galloped down the pier. This wasn't about land, wasn't about water rights, wasn't even about the Civil War, though Reconstruction politics would fuel every flame. This was something older and more dangerous, the belief that some debts can only be paid in blood, that when law enforcement wears the same badge as your enemy, justice means taking it into your own hands. That honor matters more than life itself. The killers would ride to a nearby saloon, order whiskey, and calmly announce the feud was over. They were catastrophically wrong. The violence had just reached its apex in what would become the longest and bloodiest feud in Texas history, a conflict that would claim at least 35 lives over 8 years, defeat 40 Texas Rangers under legendary Captain Leander McNelly, and force everyone who survived to ask questions they couldn't answer. If you want to understand how ordinary men, ranchers, lawmen, even a renowned ranger's brother became participants in systematic murder, subscribe now. But understand this story contains extreme violence documented in court records, witness testimonies, and newspaper archives, and it will force you to confront an uncomfortable question. What would you do if the system that's supposed to protect you becomes the weapon used against you? DeWitt County, Texas, 1868. 910 square miles of rolling prairie and river-bottom land between San Antonio and the Gulf Coast. Population 3,000 souls, scattered across ranches, connected by dirt roads that became rivers of impassable mud when it rained. The county stretched from the Guadalupe River bottoms, dense with post oak, and flooding every spring across open grassland where longhorns ran semi-wild through unfenced range. Clinton, the county seat, held maybe 300 permanent residents, 1 courthouse built of local limestone, 2 saloons with wooden walls and dirt floors, a general store, a blacksmith shop, scattered wooden buildings along unpaved streets that turned to dust in summer, to ankle-deep mud in winter. Everyone knew everyone's business, everyone's politics, everyone's grudges going back to the war that had ended just 3 years before. This was Reconstruction Texas. The South had lost. Federal troops occupied the state. Former Confederate soldiers' men who'd fought for 4 years believing they were defending their homes now faced military rule by the government they'd tried to destroy. Many lost the right to vote. Some lost property. All lost the world they'd known. The cattle economy was exploding. Longhorns that had run wild during the war years now represented wealth if you could brand them, if you could drive them to Kansas markets, if you could prove they were yours. In unfenced prairie, where half the cattle bore no marks, ownership became a matter of who got there first, who was faster with a running iron, who had the guns to back up their claim. A steer worth $3 or $4 in Texas could fetch $30 or $40 in Kansas. The difference between poverty and prosperity was a hot iron and the willingness to use it. But in 1868, cattle theft wasn't the only source of violence. The political context made everything explosive. Former Confederates viewed any federal authority as tyranny. Union soldiers enforced Reconstruction policies. And for the first time in Southern history, black soldiers held authority over white civilians. Every interaction between Taylor family members and federal troops carried the weight of occupation, of lost sovereignty, of a social order turned upside down. Into this powder keg came two families. The Taylors' descendants of Josiah Taylor, a Virginia settler who'd claimed land near Cuero in the 1850s. His sons Pitkin and Creed headed a clan that included dozens of kinsmen across DeWitt, Gonzales, and Canes counties. Creed Taylor was a renowned Texas Ranger, a man whose name carried weight across the state. Pitkin was the family patriarch, the one who settled disputes, made decisions, commanded loyalty from sons, nephews, in-laws, and allies who numbered perhaps 200 men. They were cattlemen, ranchers who'd built something from nothing, former Confederates who'd fought for a cause they believed was just, who'd lost that war but hadn't surrendered their dignity. Men who viewed the state police when it formed in 1870 as an occupying army enforcing laws they considered illegitimate. Opposing them, William E. Sutton, 21 years old in 1868, not born into power or land or legacy. He'd arrived in DeWitt County as a boy when his mother remarried a man named William McDonald. But Sutton was ambitious, capable, good with a gun and better with strategy, and he'd aligned himself with the men who had badges and federal backing. Deputy sheriff in Clinton before the feud began, soon to join the state police when it formed in 1870, a lawman in a time when law meant different things to different people. There's a legend repeated by journalists even today that the Sutton and Taylor families had feuded in South Carolina and brought their hatred west to Texas, that this was generations-old animosity transported across state lines. No evidence supports this. None. The claim appears in contemporary newspaper accounts, repeated because it made good copy, because it suggested inevitability, because it absolved everyone of responsibility for what was about to unfold. What the evidence shows is simpler and more tragic. Two men, both trying to survive in Reconstruction Texas, made choices that would destroy them both, and everyone around them. The violence started with soldiers. April 23, 1866. Buck Taylor. William P. Taylor, called Buck, shot a black sergeant named John O'Brien at a dance at a Taylor family property. The details of what provoked the shooting aren't clear in the historical record. What's clear is the result: a federal soldier dead. No arrest made, no trial. The Taylors protected their own. That same month, John Hayes Taylor killed another black soldier, Sergeant Josiah Ripley, in an Indianola saloon. Again, no arrest. The Taylors walked free while federal authorities seethed. November 14th, 1867. Hayes Taylor and his brother Philip Doby. Taylor killed two more soldiers this time, cavalry officers in Mason County, Major John Thompson, Sergeant John McDougal. The Taylor brothers disappeared into the vast Texas hill country where federal troops couldn't find them, where every ranch might hide them, where tracking two men through hundreds of square miles of rough terrain was nearly impossible. These weren't random acts. They occurred during the most bitter phase of Reconstruction. Federal troops enforced laws many Texans viewed as tyranny imposed at gunpoint. Black soldiers held authority over white civilians for the first time in Southern history. The entire social order had collapsed, and violence was the language both sides spoke. The Taylors saw themselves defending their homes from occupation, from soldiers who represented a government that had destroyed their world, from a Reconstruction policy that seemed designed to humiliate rather than rebuild. Federal authorities saw them as lawless rebels refusing to accept Confederate defeat, as men who'd rather kill than submit to legal authority, as a threat to the fragile peace. Both perspectives contained truth. Both perspectives would justify 8 years of blood. But these killings, scattered, sporadic, separated by months, weren't yet a feud. They were isolated violence in a violent time. The kind of thing that happened in Reconstruction Texas and might eventually fade as the region healed. The real ignition came on 2 specific days in 1868, and it involved William Sutton. March 25th, 1868. Deputy William Sutton led a posse 80 miles from Clinton to Bastrop, chasing horse thieves. Horse theft was serious business. Animals meant transportation, meant livelihood, meant survival. Sutton had a warrant, legal authority. When they found Charlie Taylor, a Taylor family kinsman, there was gunfire. Charlie Taylor died, shot during the arrest attempt. Whether he drew a weapon, whether he resisted, whether Sutton had any choice, the historical record doesn't definitively say. What's certain is the result: another Taylor dead at Sutton's hand. James Sharp, another suspect, was captured alive, bound, placed in custody. But on the 2-day journey back to Clinton, Sharp was shot, the official explanation attempting to escape. The journey from Bastrop crossed open prairie, forded creeks swollen with spring rain. When the posse stopped, maybe to water horses, maybe to rest, James Sharp, hands bound, reportedly tried to run. A gunshot echoed across empty prairie. The body was left beside the road to be collected later. No witnesses beyond the posse members. Just Sutton's word that Sharp had tried to escape. Just another legal killing in the line of duty. Deputy Sutton returned to Clinton, filed his report. Case closed. But to the Taylor family, this was murder under color of law. Charlie Taylor killed during an arrest that might have been an execution. James Sharp shot while in custody under circumstances that sounded like summary justice. And all of it legal. All of it justified by a badge. The pattern was established. But the explosion came 9 months later. Christmas Eve, 1868. The saloon in Clinton was crowded. Christmas Eve meant men came to town. Money in pockets from cattle sales. Whiskey flowing against the December cold that settled over South Texas when the sun went down. Temperature outside maybe 45 degrees. Inside, a wood stove fought the chill, while kerosene lamps cast yellow light and long shadows across rough plank walls. Buck Taylor and William Sutton argued over horses. The specifics of the dispute are lost to history. Maybe a sale gone bad. Maybe a question of ownership. Maybe accusations of dishonesty in a transaction. In a cash-poor economy where most business was conducted on trust and reputation, $50 worth of horses mattered. But honor mattered more. Buck Taylor accused Sutton of dishonesty. In public, in front of witnesses. In frontier Texas, that was an invitation to violence. Calling a man a cheat or a liar meant either that man had to defend his honor or accept that his word meant nothing, and a man whose word meant nothing couldn't do business, couldn't be trusted, couldn't survive. Sutton fired first. Buck Taylor fell. Dick Chisholm, just there, just Buck's friend, just unlucky, fell beside him. 2 bodies on a saloon floor on Christmas Eve, blood mixing with spilled whiskey and sawdust. The wood stove kept burning, the lamps kept flickering, life continuing around death. Buck Taylor was 30 years old, married, children at home waiting for their father to return Christmas morning with whatever small gifts he could afford. They waited until someone came to tell his wife that Buck wasn't coming home, that he'd been killed in a saloon by the deputy sheriff, that Christmas was cancelled. Dick Chisholm was collateral damage, wrong place, wrong time. A name in the historical record with no biography attached, no age recorded, no family mentioned. Just died with Buck Taylor. Christmas Eve, 1868. Multiple witnesses saw it happen. All agreed on the basic facts Sutton and Taylor had argued. Both were armed. Everyone was armed in Clinton's saloons. Sutton fired first. Both men fell. The question the law had to answer was Buck Taylor reaching for his weapon. Had he drawn, was Sutton defending himself against imminent threat? Or was this murder over an insult? Self-defense. Sutton claimed. The witnesses, some of them, Sutton allies, some neutral, some too scared to contradict a deputy sheriff, didn't disagree strongly enough to matter. The law accepted Sutton's version. No charges filed. Legal killing in self-defense. And the pattern became undeniable. William Sutton had now killed 3 Taylor-associated men in 9 months. Charlie Taylor in March, James Sharp in custody, now Buck Taylor and Chisholm on Christmas Eve. All killings ruled justified, all involving the same deputy sheriff, All legal. To the Taylor family, this wasn't law enforcement. This was systematic elimination of their family under cover of a badge. This was a man using legal authority as a weapon to destroy them. And the courts, the system that was supposed to provide justice, kept saying justified, legal, self-defense, keep moving. At Pitkin Taylor's ranch, Christmas morning, 1868. Buck Taylor's body came home. His wife wept. His children asked questions no one could answer. Why did father die? When is he coming back? What happens now? Pitkin Taylor, 60 years old, patriarch, brother of renowned Texas Ranger Creed Taylor, faced an impossible choice. 3 different paths, all of them leading to darkness. He could trust the legal system, file a complaint, demand investigation, wait for courts to act. But the shooter wore a badge. The shooter had claimed self-defense 3 times and been believed 3 times. The courts were 40 miles away and backed by federal troops. The judges answered to the Reconstruction government. Justice through legal channels had failed 3 times. Why would the 4th time be different? He could leave Texas, pack up his family, abandon the land they'd claimed and worked and bled for. Start over somewhere the Suttons couldn't reach them. Kansas maybe, California, anywhere but DeWitt County. But that meant losing everything. The ranch, the cattle, the legacy. Running meant admitting defeat, meant teaching his sons that when someone kills your family, you accept it. That power, even power wielded unjustly, wins. That the strong do what they will, and the weak suffer what they must. Or he could respond the way men in cattle country had settled disputes for generations, when law was absent or corrupt, or simply too far away, blood for blood. Personal justice, when legal justice fails. The code that said a man protects his family himself, because no one else will. Because honor demands it. Because allowing your kin to be killed without response means inviting more killing. In Reconstruction Texas, where former Confederates viewed any federal authority as tyranny, where state police were seen as occupiers, not protectors, where the nearest sheriff was 40 miles away and couldn't be trusted anyway, the choice wasn't between law and violence. The legal system had already chosen violence by declaring Sutton's killings justified. The choice was between accepting that your family could be eliminated with impunity under cover of a badge, or ensuring that killing a Taylor would cost something. Pitkin Taylor made his choice. So did his sons. So did William Sutton. By pinning on that badge and pulling that trigger 3 times. And DeWitt County would pay the price for the next 8 years. July 1870. The Texas State Police came into being, created by Governor Edmund J. Davis to enforce Reconstruction throughout Texas. The force was controversial from inception. Mixed racial composition including black officers, broad powers of arrest, authority that superseded local sheriffs, and a mandate to impose federal policy on a population that viewed any such imposition as tyranny. William Sutton joined immediately. So did Captain Jack Helm, a man whose name would become synonymous with the state police's reputation for brutality. These weren't corrupt men seeking power. They were lawmen trying to impose order in a region that viewed them as enemies. Sutton genuinely believed he was enforcing the law. Helm believed the state police could break the cycle of violence that had plagued South Texas since the war ended. But the state police had a problem. They operated with what historians delicately call a free hand. More often than not, they returned with wanted suspects dead rather than alive. August 26, 1870, 1 month after Sutton joined the state police. A Sutton-Helm posse rode to arrest brothers Henry Kelly and William Kelly on what sources describe as a trivial charge. The specifics of the charge aren't preserved in the historical record. Maybe cattle theft, maybe some minor offense that wouldn't normally warrant a posse riding miles from town. What mattered was the connection. The Kelly brothers were related to Pitkin Taylor by marriage. His sons-in-law, Taylor family. The posse took them miles from their home, away from witnesses, away from anyone who might intervene or remember details that contradicted the official version, and shot them both. Official explanation resisting arrest. The Kellys had tried to escape. The posse had no choice but to fire. Legal killing in the line of duty. Another justified use of force by state police officers enforcing the law. But there was a witness. Mrs. Henry Kelly had followed the posse. Maybe she sensed what was coming. Maybe she'd heard stories about other arrests that ended with bodies instead of prisoners. She stayed far enough back that they didn't see her, close enough to watch what happened. She hid in the brush, watched as her husband and brother-in-law were marched away from the horses, hands raised, no weapons drawn, no resistance. The sources say she watched them surrounded by armed men. Then she heard the gunfire, saw them fall, watched the posse mount up and ride away, leaving the bodies as though they were nothing, like executing 2 men on their knees was just another day's work. Mrs. Kelly waited until silence, until certainty they were gone. Then she walked to the bodies. Her husband, his brother, both dead, both murdered, regardless of what the official report would say. Jack Helm was dismissed from the state police after this killing came to light. The brass couldn't ignore a witness who contradicted their narrative, but he was legally cleared of wrongdoing. No charges. No trial. No consequences beyond losing his state police commission, and he continued serving as DeWitt County Sheriff, still wearing a badge, still carrying the authority to arrest and kill. The message to the Taylor family was clear. Law enforcement could kill Taylor-associated men, claim they were resisting arrest, and face no real consequences even when a witness said otherwise. Even when that witness was a widow who'd watched her husband executed on his knees. Badges trumped truth. Authority trumped justice. From the Sutton faction's view, the Kellys were dangerous men connected to a family that had killed federal soldiers and resisted legal authority at every turn. Arresting them peacefully was impossible. They would have fought. They would have escaped. Better to end the threat definitively, even if the methods were extra-legal. From the Taylor family's view, badges had become licenses for murder. The state police wasn't law enforcement. It was a death squad eliminating their family one arrest at a time. Both things were true simultaneously. The Kelly brothers' execution was a watershed. It proved that legal authority meant Taylor men could be eliminated without consequence. That the courts would accept any killing as justified if the killer wore a badge. That justice wasn't available through legal channels. That the system designed to protect citizens had become the weapon used against them. The Taylors responded the way you'd expect. They stopped waiting to be arrested. Summer, 1872. A Texas evening temperature still 85 degrees even as the sun set. Cicadas screaming in the trees with that deafening pulse that makes conversation difficult. Humidity thick enough to chew, the kind that leaves shirts soaked and makes every movement feel like wading through water. Pitkin Taylor sat in his ranch house, 60 years old, patriarch of the Taylor clan. The man who'd held his family together through the war, through Reconstruction, through the mounting violence that had claimed Buck Taylor, the Kelly brothers, and others whose names don't survive in the historical record. The man who'd made the choice on Christmas morning 1868 to respond with blood rather than law. Then he heard it, the rhythmic clank, clank, clank of a cowbell. Cattle in his cornfield. The corn was growing tall midsummer growth, maybe 6 or 7 feet high by this point in the season. Valuable crop. If cattle got in and trampled it or ate it down, that was a significant loss. Someone needed to drive them out before they destroyed what represented months of work and a significant portion of the ranch's food supply. Pitkin grabbed a stick, the traditional tool for driving cattle, just something to wave and make noise, maybe called to his sons that he'd handle it. Walked into the cornfield as darkness gathered, twilight fading to night, shadows lengthening between the tall stalks. The corn was tall enough to hide men. The attackers, Sutton faction members, whose names aren't preserved with certainty in the sources, waited. Let him walk deep into the field, far from the house, far from help. Then opened fire, multiple gunshots in the summer darkness. Pitkin fell among his own corn, blood soaking into Texas dirt, cicadas still screaming their indifferent chorus. He survived. For 6 months. He survived. This was 1872, no antibiotics, no modern surgery, no trauma medicine beyond whiskey and prayer, just infected wounds that wouldn't heal, fever that came and went, slow deterioration of a body that had been strong enough to work cattle and survive the war, but couldn't survive multiple gunshot wounds. 6 months of watching his sons' faces harden as they understood their father was dying. 6 months knowing vengeance would come. 6 months understanding the cycle would continue long after he was gone. He died in winter, likely December 1872 or January 1873. The sources don't preserve the exact date, just the certainty of his death and the manner of it. At his funeral, Jim Taylor stood over his father's grave, 20 years old. No longer the youngest son deferring to his father's decisions, now the leader. Historical accounts record that he and his relatives resolved to revenge Pitkin's death. Not a casual promise, a vow, a commitment that would define the rest of Jim Taylor's short life. This was the transition from older generation to younger, from cautious patriarchs who remembered peacetime to sons who'd known only violence, from men who might have chosen peace if given the chance to men who wanted blood because blood was all that made sense anymore. Jim Taylor wasn't a wild man, wasn't the stereotypical hothead outlaw that dime novels portrayed. Those who knew him described him as mild-mannered, thoughtful, soft-spoken, but with eyes steady, steel grey that seemed to look straight through you, eyes that calculated, that remembered, that never forgave. Everyone who met him said the same thing: he never forgave what happened to his father, never forgot, just nursed his revenge, waiting for the right moment, the right opportunity, the right chance to settle the debt. That moment came in July 1873. Early 1872, a 19-year-old gunfighter named John Wesley Hardin joined his cousin Manon Clements in neighboring Gonzales County. Hardin was already notorious, already wanted for multiple killings across Texas, on the run from law enforcement, moving from county to county, leaving bodies behind him. The Clements brothers were cattle ranchers or cattle rustlers, depending on who you asked, and close allies of the Taylor family. When Hardin showed up, he brought his reputation and his guns into the Taylor orbit, the most dangerous outlaw in Texas, aligned with a family that had declared war on law enforcement. From the Taylor perspective, this was reinforcement. Family, even distant family by marriage helping family. A deadly gun when they needed deadly guns. From the Sutton faction's perspective, this proved what they'd always said: the Taylors were criminals, harboring wanted men, aligning with murderers. Everything the state police had done was justified. July 17th, 1873. A blacksmith shop in Albuquerque, Texas, in Wilson County. Not DeWitt County, not the feud's home territory. But feuds don't respect county lines. Jack Helm, former state police captain, current DeWitt County sheriff. The man who'd killed the Kelly brothers and walked away legally cleared was there on legitimate business. Maybe getting a horse shod, maybe having equipment repaired. The sources don't specify. What they do specify is that he'd left his revolvers at his boarding house. He was unarmed. The blacksmith shop would have been stifling. Forge fire burning coal, metal being hammered on the anvil with that rhythmic clanging. Temperature inside maybe 110, 115 degrees. Smell of coal smoke and hot iron. Confined space, maybe 20 by 30 feet. Jim Taylor approached from behind, drew his revolver, aimed at Jack Helm's back, and pulled the trigger. The gun misfired, a click instead of a shot. Percussion cap failure, or damp powder, or mechanical malfunction, the sources don't say. Just that the gun didn't fire when it should have. In that instant, 1 second, maybe 2, Jack Helm turned, saw Jim Taylor, saw the revolver pointed at him, understood in that moment that he was about to die. Did Jim Taylor hesitate? Did any part of him reconsider? Did he think about claiming it was an accident, that the gun had gone off by mistake, that he hadn't meant to be there with murder on his mind? The sources say he fired immediately. No hesitation. The gun worked the second time. The bullet hit Helm in the chest. A center mass shot. Mortal wound. But Helm didn't fall. He rushed toward Taylor, trying to grapple, to fight hand to hand despite the bullet in his chest, to maybe disarm this boy who'd just shot him. Then John Wesley Hardin, who'd been waiting outside or hidden in the shop, fired his shotgun. The blast shattered Helm's arm, bone and flesh destroyed, the arm useless. Helm tried to flee deeper into the blacksmith shop, maybe looking for a weapon, maybe just trying to get away, to survive long enough for help to arrive. But Hardin held the townspeople at gunpoint. No one could intervene. No one could help. They had to stand there and watch. Jim Taylor chased Helm down, fired 5 more shots. 5. An execution, not a fight, making certain that the man who'd killed his father's sons-in-law would never kill another Taylor. When it was over, Jim Taylor and John Wesley Hardin mounted their horses. Witnesses reported that they boasted, loud enough for everyone to hear, "We accomplished what we came to do." That misfire haunts the historical record. When Jim Taylor's gun failed and Jack Helm turned to face him, that was the last moment Taylor could have walked away. Could have claimed it was an accident. Could have said he'd changed his mind. That he couldn't go through with murder. He didn't. He pulled the trigger again. And again. And again. And again. And again. We'll never know if he hesitated for even a second. If any part of him questioned whether killing this man would honor his father or just perpetuate the cycle that had already claimed so many lives. We only know his action. He chose to finish what he'd started. The night after Helm's death, the Taylor faction surrounded Joe Tumlinson's ranch house near Yorktown. Tumlinson was a Sutton stronghold, one of their key supporters. Armed men on both sides. A siege. Waiting for someone to make a move that would restart the shooting. Finally, the sheriff arrived with a posse, talked both sides down, negotiated a truce, got them to sign an agreement in Clinton promising to end the violence. For 5 months, July to December, 1873, the killing stopped. 5 months when DeWitt County could breathe. When wives stopped fearing every hoofbeat in the distance. When children played without hearing guns being cleaned and loaded nearby. When men went to town without checking sight lines and escape routes. 5 months of hope that maybe, finally, it was over. That Helm's death had satisfied honor. That both sides had lost enough. December 30th, 1873. Wiley, Washington. Pridgeon, a Taylor supporter, was shot and killed at Thomaston Station, and the truce shattered like glass. Someone pulled that trigger knowing it would reignite the war, knowing 5 months of peace would end, knowing more men would die. Why the historical record is silent on motive? Maybe personal grudge that had nothing to do with the larger feud. Maybe an accident that escalated. Maybe someone who couldn't let go of hatred even when everyone else wanted peace. But the result was certain: the feud resumed, and the killing that had stopped would continue for 3 more years. 3 months after Sutton's death at the Indianola dock, the temperature in DeWitt County reached that summer peak where Texas becomes nearly uninhabitable. June 1874. Mid-90s during the day, 80s even after sunset. Humidity from the Gulf, making every breath feel like drowning in warm water. 3 cowboys, Rufus P., Rufus, Scrap, Taylor, John Alfred, Cute, Tuggle, and James White were driving cattle north for John Wesley Hardin. Legitimate work, legal employment. They were in Hamilton, Texas, over 100 miles from DeWitt County, when they were arrested for cattle theft. The charges were likely false. The Texas State Historical Association's assessment, written with the careful language of academic historians who don't make accusations lightly, states they were probably innocent of any wrongdoing. Probably. Because even historians can't be completely certain across 150 years. But the evidence suggests these were working cowboys doing legal work who happened to have the wrong last name. They were brought back to Clinton, held in the courthouse jail, probably just a few cells in the back of the building. Wood and iron bars. summer heat making it stifling inside. The jail had no ventilation to speak of. Temperature inside maybe 105, 110 degrees. The smell of sweat and fear and limestone walls that held the day's heat long into night. The three men probably understood what was coming when they heard the mob outside. Night of June 20th, 1874. Voices. Footsteps. The sound of many men moving with purpose. In 1874 Texas, lynch mobs weren't unusual, especially for men associated with the Taylor family. They were taken from the jail. No trial. No formal charges proven. No opportunity to present evidence of innocence or call witnesses who might testify that they were just cowboys doing a job. Just rope and darkness, and the certainty that in blood feuds, innocence doesn't matter as much as association. All three were hanged near Clinton. One historical account notes with grim cynicism that the mob thoughtfully hanged them close to the cemetery for the convenience of their relatives. Close enough that the bodies wouldn't have far to travel. Close enough that burying them would be efficient. A gesture that might have seemed like mercy, but reads like mockery. They were probably innocent of any wrongdoing. Not, they were innocent, probably innocent, because in the feud, proof didn't matter. Taylor association equaled guilt. Sutton and Slaughter dead in March meant debt owed. 3 bodies balanced against 2. The math of vengeance. From the Sutton faction's perspective, this was justice. Their leader shot down in front of his wife, Gabriel Slaughter, who'd done nothing except stand beside a friend killed as collateral. The Taylor brothers rode away, stopped for whiskey, boasted about their work. 3 Taylor men for 2 Sutton men was almost fair, almost balanced. Blood debt paid. From the Taylor faction's perspective, this was murder. 3 cowboys arrested on false charges in a distant county, brought back to hostile territory, lynched without trial, murdered while in custody by men who wore no badges, who represented no legal authority, who were just a mob enforcing their own version of justice. From historical distance, this reveals what feuds become machines that consume innocent people. Scrap Taylor, Cute Tuggle, and Jim White probably had nothing to do with the Indianola killings. They were just available Taylor-associated men when the Sutton faction needed revenge. They were probably innocent, but probably wasn't enough to save them. August 1st, 1874. Captain Leander H. McNelly rode into Clinton with 40 Texas Rangers. The Rangers were legendary men who'd fought Comanches and Mexican bandits, who'd brought law to the wildest parts of Texas, who represented the state's most effective law enforcement. If anyone could stop the Sutton-Taylor feud, conventional wisdom said, it would be McNelly. McNelly was 30 years old, Civil War veteran, Confederate cavalry officer who'd proven himself in battle. Strategic mind, tough, sometimes ruthless when circumstances demanded, but he was also dying. Tuberculosis consumption. They called it in 1874 was slowly destroying his lungs. He'd suffered from it since childhood. Now, at 30, he looked older, moved slower, struggled for breath in the Texas heat that made every exertion feel like suffocation. He had 4 months to stop violence that had been escalating for 6 years. 40 men to patrol 910 square miles. 40 Rangers against perhaps 400 men spread across multiple counties who'd committed to blood vengeance as the only acceptable resolution. The mission was impossible from the start. McNelly understood law enforcement. He understood tactics. What he couldn't understand, what no outsider could understand, was the cultural context that made this conflict different from banditry or organized crime. This wasn't criminals versus law. This was 2 factions, both believing themselves justified, both viewing the other as evil, both committed to blood debt as the only honorable resolution. Consider McNelly's actual options. He could arrest people, but whom 400 men were involved to varying degrees. Some had killed, some had provided material support, some had just chosen sides and made their allegiance known. Which ones do you arrest? All of them? There wasn't jail space in Texas to hold 400 men. And on what evidence witnesses wouldn't testify? Everyone who'd seen anything was either too terrified or too complicit to speak. He could try mediation, get both sides to sign a truce, negotiate peace. They'd already tried that in July 1873 after Helm's death. Lasted 5 months before someone broke it. What makes anyone think a second truce would work better than the first? He could provide protection, keep both factions separated, prevent contact, stop the killing through sheer presence. But 40 men can't protect everyone across 910 square miles. Can't be everywhere. Can't prevent ambushes in cornfields or blacksmith shops or steamboat docks. Someone would get through. Someone always got through. He could target the leaders, arrest Jim Taylor and Billy Taylor, remove the organizing force behind the Taylor faction. But Jim Taylor had survived multiple attempts to capture him. He knew the terrain. He had 200 supporters who'd hide him, feed him, warn him when Rangers approached. And Billy Taylor Billy was in jail awaiting trial for Sutton's murder. McNally's Rangers were protecting him so he'd survive to face justice. Arresting him would accomplish nothing, he was already arrested. For 4 months, 40 Rangers patrolled DeWitt County. Provided security for Billy Taylor's trial. Tried to prevent further killings. Failed at almost everything except keeping Billy Taylor alive long enough to stand trial. The historical assessment is blunt. They tried unsuccessfully for several months to break up the feud. Unsuccessfully. Complete failure. The legendary Texas Rangers, defeated by a conflict they couldn't solve because law enforcement can't solve problems rooted in honor culture and blood debt. September 15th, 1875. A hurricane category. 3 or higher slammed into Indianola. Winds exceeding 100 miles per hour. Storm surge flooding the docks where William Sutton had died 18 months earlier. Buildings collapsing. The city drowning in seawater and rain and chaos. Billy Taylor sat in jail awaiting trial for murder. The trial that McNally's Rangers had protected him to ensure. The legal process that was supposed to prove the system worked. That justice could be achieved through courts rather than bullets. In the chaos, guards evacuating, building damaged, city in panic, Billy Taylor escaped. Nature succeeded where Rangers failed. By destroying the jail, the hurricane freed one of the feud's primary killers. Billy Taylor was never recaptured, never stood trial for Sutton's murder. The legal process that was supposed to bring closure just vanished in wind and water. November 18th, 1875. Reuben Rube. Brown, new leader of the Sutton faction after Sutton's death. Former Marshal of Cuero was killed in Cuero by 5 men. Taylor faction. Revenge for Brown's role in pursuing them. For arrests he'd made. For sides he'd chosen. Tom Freeman, a black man who happened to be nearby, was killed as well. Another black man was wounded. Collateral damage. Wrong place. Wrong time. The violence spreading to anyone unfortunate enough to be present when vengeance arrived. December 27th, 1875, near Clinton, Texas. Jim Taylor, 23 years old, leader of the Taylor faction for 3 years since his father's death. The man who'd killed Jack Helm and helped kill William Sutton died in a gunfight with a Cuero posse. Sutton faction members. 2 companions died with him. The details of the fight aren't preserved with much specificity, just the certainty of the result, Jim Taylor dead. The Taylor faction's charismatic, fearless leader gone. Jim Taylor wasn't a monster. Historical descriptions call him mild-mannered, thoughtful, but with eyes, those steel-grey eyes that never forgave, that nursed revenge, that watched and waited and remembered every death. He was 23 years old, born in 1852, would never see 1876, never marry, never have children, never grow old. Just die young in Texas dirt, fighting a war his father had started and he'd perpetuated, and that would continue even after his death. With the death of Jim Taylor, the Sutton-Taylor feud proper came to an end, wrote C.L. Sonicson decades later. The word proper doing heavy lifting in that sentence. The main feud ended. The organized violence between named factions, but the killing that would continue for another year. Because blood feuds don't have clean endings. They just fade, exhaust themselves, run out of people willing to die. By December 1875, both factions had lost their leaders. Sutton dead in March 1874. Jim Taylor dead in December 1875. The men who'd organized the violence, who'd commanded loyalty, who'd kept the anger burning gone. What remained were exhausted supporters, widows, orphans, and a community that had spent 7 years living with constant violence. Captain McNally withdrew his rangers. Mission failed. The feud hadn't ended because of law enforcement. It had just burned itself out, exhausted both sides, killed enough people that even honor culture couldn't justify more deaths. Sometimes conflicts don't get solved. They just stop because everyone's too tired to continue. McNally returned to other duties. Died less than 2 years later, September 4th, 1877, at age 33. Tuberculosis finally claimed him. Did the stress of DeWitt County accelerate his disease? Impossible to know. But it's hard not to wonder if carrying the weight of that impossible mission didn't make his illness worse. If dying slowly while watching men kill each other over honor and revenge didn't take something vital from him. The Rangers had failed because some conflicts can't be stopped by law enforcement. They have to burn themselves out, consume enough lives that even the survivors understand there's nothing left worth fighting for. September 18th, 1876. A year after Jim Taylor's death. A year when everyone thought the worst was over. Dr. Philip H. Brassell sat in his home near Yorktown preparing to die. Not from violence from tuberculosis. The same disease that had killed Captain McNally. The same disease that brought Dr. Brassell from Georgia to Texas in 1870, hoping the climate might help. It hadn't. Now, at 48 years old, he was making final arrangements. He distributed his property, gave his wife Mary Ann money for funeral expenses, selected his burial site. The preparations a dying man makes when he knows death is coming and wants to spare his family the burden of decisions made in grief. He was a respected physician, had served in the Georgia Constitutional Convention in 1866, state legislator from 1868 to 1870, a man of education and standing. Yes, he sympathized with the Taylor family. Yes, his oldest son George had gotten involved with the feud, had a price on his head for actions historians don't fully detail. But Dr. Brassell himself, he'd done nothing violent, hurt no one. He was simply dying of disease, making peace with mortality. He never imagined he'd be murdered the next night. September 19th, 1876. Approximately 10 o'clock in the evening. Temperature probably mid-70s, pleasant by Texas standards. Cool enough to sleep with windows open. The Brassell household was settling for the night when someone outside yelled, "Hello." At first they probably thought it was a neighbor, someone needing the doctor's services. Medical emergencies didn't respect the clock. Dr. Brassell might have started to rise, to gather his bag, to answer whatever call had come. Then the same voice yelled, "Surround the house, boys." Armed men, masked, emerged from darkness and surrounded the home, ordered Dr. Brassell and his 3 sons outside. The doctor weak from tuberculosis, no weapon, no threat to anyone. George, yes. George was an outlaw, had chosen sides, had participated in the violence. But the 2 younger sons, just boys whose names aren't even consistently recorded in the historical record, just present, just there. The masked men marched all 4 down the dirt road away from the house, away from light, away from witnesses, into darkness where gunshots wouldn't immediately reveal location. Did Dr. Brassell plead? Did he mention his disease, his imminent natural death, his irrelevance to any feud business? Did George beg for his father's life? Did the younger sons understand what was happening? Or did they think this was arrest? That they'd be taken to jail? That there'd be a trial gunfire in the darkness? Dr. Brassell fell. George fell beside him. The 2 younger sons ran. Somehow luck or mercy or distraction they escaped into the night. Mrs. Mary Ann Brassell heard the shots. Or maybe she heard nothing, and only realized later when the men rode away and silence descended. Either way, she began searching. For hours, she searched in darkness, calling names, looking for bodies. She found George first. 2 hours of searching before she located her son's body. Then, 35 yards away, she found her husband. Both dead. Both executed. The doctor who'd been preparing to die with dignity, now lying in Texas dirt with bullet holes instead of tuberculosis claiming him. This deed aroused the greatest indignation. The historical accounts say, greatest indignation, in a feud that had seen 35 confirmed deaths over 8 years, in a conflict that had witnessed Christmas Eve murders and lynchings and ambushes. This killing was different. Why? Because Dr. Brazel wasn't a combatant, wasn't a gunfighter or a lawman, or someone who'd chosen to participate. He was a respected physician dying of disease, a man of education and standing, a former state legislator, a healer, not a killer. And he was murdered in front of his family for the crime of having a son involved in the feud and sympathizing with the wrong side. Even in brutal blood feuds, some people should be off limits. The young, the old, the innocent, the dying. Some boundaries should be sacred. The Brazel murders proved those boundaries had dissolved entirely. From the Sutton faction's perspective, George Brazel was a legitimate target. Outlaw, price on his head. Taylor partisan who'd participated in violence. The doctor he'd harbored George, given him shelter, chosen sides by protecting his own son. In feud logic, family members of combatants are themselves combatants. If Dr. Brazel didn't want to die, he shouldn't have let George stay, shouldn't have sympathized with Taylors, shouldn't have chosen the wrong side. From the community's perspective, this crossed every line. Dr. Brazel wasn't carrying a gun, wasn't planning violence, was dying anyway. Tuberculosis would claim him in weeks or months. Executing a dying doctor in front of his sons wasn't justice or honor or even revenge. It was just murder. 8 men were arrested and charged, all Sutton faction members. Judge Henry Clay Pleasance requested Texas Rangers intervention, asked specifically for Lieutenant Jesse Lee Hall, who'd served under McNelly and had a reputation for decisive action. The Rangers returned to DeWitt County, made arrests, brought formal charges. A series of legal maneuvers lasting over 20 years resulted in only one conviction, and that person was eventually pardoned. 8 men arrested, 5 freed on technicalities, improper warrants, jurisdictional questions, procedural errors that had nothing to do with guilt or innocence. 1 murdered, presumably to prevent his testimony from implicating the others. 1 convicted Dave Augustine, and Augustine pardoned before he ever spent a day in prison. 0 consequences, 0 justice. Just 8 more names added to the list of people who'd killed with impunity in DeWitt County. The Brazel murders revealed what the feud had become. In 1868, the killings had justifications however flawed, however self-serving, however morally questionable. Buck Taylor and William Sutton argued over horses and honor. Sutton was a deputy enforcing law. Taylor was a rancher, defending reputation. Both men armed. Both men participants in a culture that settled disputes with violence. By 1876, the feud was killing respected dying doctors for association, for sympathizing, for having a son who chose the wrong side. The boundaries of who deserved to die had expanded until everyone became a target. Violence breeds more violence. And the moral lines that might have constrained early killing just disappeared under the weight of accumulated blood debt. October 1876. Lieutenant Jesse Lee Hall, 27 years old. McNelly's second-in-command took control of the Ranger force when McNelly's tuberculosis made continued service impossible. Hall was North Carolina-born, moved to Texas in 1869, served as town marshal, deputy sheriff, sergeant at arms for the Texas Senate, joined Rangers in August 1876. Now, 2 months later, he was leading them back to DeWitt County. Captain McNelly had tried peacekeeping, mediation, protecting witnesses so trials could proceed, hoping the legal system would resolve what guns couldn't. He'd failed. 4 months of 40 rangers accomplished nothing except keeping Billy Taylor alive long enough for a hurricane to free him. Hall understood what McNally hadn't. You can't stop a feud by trying to protect everyone. You stop it by removing the people organizing the violence, by targeting leadership, by making decisive arrests and breaking the faction's ability to coordinate revenge. Hall moved fast, arrested 7 members of the Sutton faction key leaders, organizers, the men who planned attacks and maintained the network of supporters, not general peacekeeping, not gradual pressure, just targeted removal of the people making the violence possible. His report to superiors was 5 words: the agony is over. Simple, direct, confident, no hedging, no qualifications, just certainty that he'd accomplished what McNally couldn't. By January 1877, 8 years and 10 months after Buck Taylor died on Christmas Eve, the organized violence ended. Not because anyone forgave, not because justice was served, not because the grievances disappeared. The feud ended because both factions lost their organizing capability and the community was too exhausted to continue. Jim Taylor had died in December 1875, William Sutton in March 1874, Jack Helm in July 1873. Pitkin Taylor in 1872 or 73, every major leader of both factions dead or arrested or in hiding. Without leadership, without organizing structure, the factions couldn't coordinate revenge, couldn't plan attacks, couldn't maintain the networks that had sustained 8 years of killing. The community was exhausted. 8 years of violence, 35 confirmed dead, possibly as many as 80. Every family had lost someone or knew someone who had. The economy devastated, cattle drives disrupted, businesses closed, property values collapsed. Who wants to settle in a county where armed men shoot each other in the streets? What merchant stays when customers might be killed walking to his store? The political context had changed. Reconstruction ended. Democrats returned to power. The state police that had been such a source of grievance was disbanded. Governor Richard Koch's administration represented a new political equilibrium. Some of the fuel that had fed the feud's fire, the sense of federal occupation, of illegitimate authority, had dissipated. And critically, Hall's Rangers stayed, not for 4 months like McNally, not trying to mediate or protect or keep peace, just staying, maintaining presence, demonstrating that the state had authority and would use it, making clear that anyone who restarted the violence would face immediate arrest. By January 1877, Jesse Lee Hall and his supporting troop had put an end to the conflict once and for all. The same county where Christmas Eve 1868 had seen Buck Taylor killed in a saloon, where Pitkin Taylor had been lured by a cowbell into his cornfield, where Jim Taylor had chased Jack Helm through a blacksmith shop, where 35 confirmed men had died over honor and badges and blood debt. The graveyards were full, the families were broken, the land held memories of violence in every hollow and creek bottom. Hall's Rangers rode through DeWitt County, and for the first time in nearly a decade, no one shot at them, no one organized ambushes, no one planned retribution, not because they forgave, not because wounds had healed, because they were beaten down, too tired, too traumatized, too few survivors left with the energy to continue fighting a war that had consumed everything they'd built. What actually ended the Sutton-Taylor feud, law enforcement played a role. Hall's targeted arrests removed organizing capability. But McNally's earlier deployment had failed completely, suggesting Rangers alone weren't sufficient. Exhaustion played a role. 8 years of killing wore everyone down. But exhaustion alone wouldn't have stopped violence if leaders were still coordinating attacks. Leadership loss played a role. Both factions lost their charismatic leaders. But new leaders could have emerged if conditions supported continued fighting. The truth is, feuds don't end from one cause. They end when multiple factors align, when key leaders die, when communities exhaust themselves, when external pressure increases, when political contexts change, when everyone is too broken to perpetuate violence anymore. The Sutton-Taylor feud ended in January 1877 because all those factors aligned simultaneously. Because Jesse Lee Hall arrested the right people at the right time. Because both sides had lost too much to continue. Because Reconstruction's end removed some grievances. Because a community that had lived with violence for 8 years was finally, desperately, ready for it to stop. Violence breeds more violence until everyone is too broken to perpetuate it anymore. At least 35 men dead. That's the confirmed count. Multiple historical sources agree on this minimum. Some historians suggest the real toll approached 80, including indirect deaths, violence in surrounding counties, killings attributed to other causes to avoid investigation. The uncertainty exists because record-keeping in rural 1870s Texas was sporadic at best. Some deaths were never officially reported. Some were disguised as accidents. Fear prevented witnesses from documenting what they'd seen, and the violence spread across multiple counties: DeWitt, Gonzales, Victoria, Canes, each keeping separate incomplete records that were never reconciled, but 35 confirmed. In a county of 3,000 people, that's more than 1% of the entire population killed by violence in 8 years. Every family knew someone who died. Every family attended funerals. Every child grew up understanding that violence was normal, expected, inevitable. Every woman lived with the constant fear of widowhood. Walk through DeWitt County cemeteries today. Read the tombstones clustered between 1868 and 1876. All those young men, 20s, 30s, 40s, who should have lived to be grandfathers. Men who died over cattle, over honor, over badges that meant different things to different people, over blood debts that expanded until everyone became a target. William Sutton, age 27. Deputy sheriff turned state police turned victim, killed while trying to escape the violence he'd helped create. Jim Taylor, age 23. Mild-mannered rancher's son turned killer, nursing revenge that consumed his short life. Dr. Philip Brassell, age 48. Respected physician dying of tuberculosis, murdered for sympathizing with the wrong family. And 32 others whose names survive in the historical record, plus an unknown number whose deaths were never documented. The Kelly brothers executed on their knees while a widow watched from hiding. Scrap Taylor, Cute Tuggle, and Jim White, probably innocent cowboys lynched to balance accounts. Gabriel Slaughter, just standing beside a friend on a dock. Dick Chisholm, just present when honor demanded blood. From a legal perspective, none of them deserved extrajudicial execution. From the feuding factions' perspectives, all had violated honor codes that demanded death. From historical distance, most were ordinary men trapped in impossible situations where every choice led to darkness. The tragedy isn't that bad people died. It's that ordinary people became killers and victims in a cycle no one could stop. John Wesley Hardin, the most famous participant, continued his outlaw career after the feud. May 26, 1874, his 21st birthday, he killed Deputy Charles Webb in Comanche, Texas. That killing finally brought serious consequences. A mob formed. 3 prisoners were liberated from jail and lynched. 2 of Hardin's relatives were killed by rangers in retaliation. The cycle expanding beyond DeWitt County, Hardin ran for 3 years, Texas to Alabama to Florida. Ranger John B. Armstrong caught him on a train in Pensacola on August 23, 1877. 25-year sentence. He served 16 years, studied law in prison, became an attorney after release, practiced law in El Paso until August 19, 1895, when Constable John Selman Sr. shot him from behind while he gambled in a saloon. Age 42, survived prison, but not his reputation. Billy Taylor escaped during the 1875 hurricane that destroyed Indianola, never recaptured for Sutton's murder. His ultimate fate unclear in the historical record, he simply vanished into Texas. Another name that appeared briefly in violence, then disappeared into obscurity. The Brassell murder trials consumed over 20 years. 8 men arrested. 5 freed on technicalities, improper warrants. jurisdictional questions, procedural errors that had nothing to do with actual guilt or innocence. One murdered, presumably to prevent testimony. One convicted Dave Augustine, and Augustine was pardoned before serving a single day. Zero consequences, zero justice. The pattern that had defined the feud from the beginning, killings without accountability, continued even after the organized violence ended. Why did the trials fail? Witness intimidation. People feared retaliation even years later. Both sides still had supporters willing to threaten anyone who testified. Jury nullification. Local juries sympathized with defendants. Feud logic remained operative. Evidence decay. Years between crimes and trials meant witnesses died, moved away, conveniently forgot details, and legal technicalities. Defense attorneys found procedural errors in cases that dragged through courts for decades. The uncomfortable question: if legal justice is impossible, if courts can't convict, if witnesses won't testify, is there any alternative to blood feud? Or does law become meaningless when community consensus supports violence? The widows and children survived. Susan Sutton raised her children without William. Dr. Brassell's widow Mary Ann buried her husband and son. Multiple Taylor widows faced poverty and stigma. The children grew up fatherless in a traumatized community. Some left Texas entirely. Some stayed, carrying grudges that would simmer for generations. DeWitt County's economy collapsed. Cattle drives avoided the region. Who wants to drive herds through a war zone? Property values plummeted. Who invests in a county where armed men might kill you in the street? Businesses relocated. Families fled. Population declined. The county's reputation as that violent place persisted for decades. Recovery took generations. What was it all for? What did William Sutton die for? Enforcing the law, from his perspective, supporting Reconstruction policy, protecting his family, his honor as a lawman. But he didn't accomplish safety, killed anyway at 27. Didn't accomplish justice, his killers walked free. Didn't accomplish peace. The feud continued after his death. His legacy became participation in Texas's bloodiest feud, not effective law enforcement. What did Jim Taylor die for? Avenging his father, defending family honor, resisting what he viewed as tyrannical state authority. His pride as a Texan who wouldn't submit. But he didn't accomplish safety, killed at 23. Didn't accomplish justice. The Sutton faction continued operating after his death. Didn't accomplish peace, violence continued. His legacy became outlaw gunfighter, not family defender. What did Dr. Brassell die for? Nothing. Wrong association, wrong timing, wrong side, guilt by sympathy. His death accomplished community outrage that helped bring final peace. But his killers went unpunished. His legacy became tragic victim of a conflict he didn't participate in. Nobody won. The Sutton faction lost their leader and saw their remaining members arrested or scattered. The Taylor faction lost their patriarch, his sons, and their organizing structure. The community lost a decade of growth and hundreds of thousands in economic damage. The widows lost husbands. The children lost fathers. The dead lost everything. For what? For honor. For pride. For the belief that some debts can only be paid in blood. For the conviction that when legal systems fail, personal justice becomes necessary. For codes that said a man who won't defend his family isn't a man at all. 8 years of terror. 1868 to 1876, with aftermath continuing into 1877. Every family affected, every business damaged, every interaction shadowed by the possibility of violence, a generation traumatized by growing up in constant fear. Drive through Clinton today, population perhaps 400, quiet, small town courthouse square, pickup trucks, feed stores, agricultural economy, could be anywhere in rural Texas. The courthouse still stands where Scrap Taylor, Cute Tuggle, and Jim White were taken by a mob and lynched. The ground still holds foundations where Sutton's saloon stood. The streets where Jim Taylor died are paved now, marked with no memorial. Most people who live there don't know the details. The feud is local history, taught in schools, mentioned in passing. Historical markers are vague about the violence. Museums acknowledge it happened. But the visceral reality, the terror of living through it, has faded. Except in the cemeteries. Walk through them. Read stones from 1868 to 1876. All those dates clustered together. All those young deaths. The dead remember, even if the living have forgotten. The Sutton-Taylor feud asks questions we can't answer. When does defense become murder? Sutton defended the law from his view. Sutton murdered Taylors from theirs. Both true simultaneously. When does law enforcement become tyranny? State police enforced Reconstruction. State police persecuted ex-Confederates. Depends on perspective. What is justice when courts fail? The legal system couldn't stop violence or convict killers. What remains when law is powerless? Where is the line defending family becomes murder? Enforcing law becomes assassination. Seeking justice becomes revenge. The line keeps moving until it disappears entirely. And the question that makes everyone uncomfortable. What would you do if someone killed your father and the law did nothing? If that someone wore a badge and claimed self-defense? If courts wouldn't help? If the system designed to protect you became the weapon used against you? What would you do? Trust the legal system. After it fails 3 times, 10 times. Leave everything you've built and everyone you know. Fight back, knowing you'll probably die or destroy your family. Do nothing and live with that choice forever. There are no good answers, only choices, each with terrible consequences. The Sutton-Taylor feud isn't just history. It's a question about what happens when systems fail, about what ordinary people become when pushed past breaking points, about cycles of violence that consume everyone involved. The land remembers nothing. Grass grows over old foundations. Rivers run the same as always. But in cemeteries, stones mark young deaths and ask questions we don't want to answer about justice, revenge, and what we'd do if pushed to edges those men faced. The feud ended in 1877. The questions never will, because they're not about 1874 Texas. They're about human nature. About what we become when systems that should protect us fail. About choices we hope we'll never face but can't honestly say how we'd resolve. That's what makes the Sutton-Taylor feud eternal. Not the violence is common, but the moral complexity, the absence of heroes, the understanding that everyone believed they were right, everyone made terrible choices, and everyone paid prices that far exceeded anything honor could justify. Subscribe for more true stories that challenge simple narratives. Comment, what would you have done? Where's the line between justice and murder? Because these questions aren't historical curiosities. They're happening now, somewhere, as families make the same desperate choices for the same impossible reasons. The stones stand silent in DeWitt County cemeteries, witnesses to what happens when honor matters more than life, when law means less than blood, when ordinary people become killers for reasons that made perfect sense at the time, but look insane from distance. The dead can't answer our questions. They can only remind us, this happened, could happen again, might be happening now, and none of us knows what we do until faced with choices that have no good outcomes.